Rights Watch, with the help of the Stanford Law School's Human Rights Clinic, has just published a new report that explains that the Chinese government has been committing and continues to commit crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other Turkic communities in Xinjiang. And crimes against humanity are among the most serious under international law. They're widespread, systematic attacks intentionally committed against the civilian population. And some of the kinds of crimes we've documented include things like family separations, enforced disappearances, and cultural persecution. Well, we've looked in recent years at mass arbitrary detention and arrests. That also rises to the level of crimes against humanity. The use of pervasive Orwellian surveillance technology, and the most pervasive restrictions in the world that any government has placed on the practice of Islam. Taken together, these are serious human rights crimes that in other parts of the world have triggered a very strong international response, and the kind of independent investigation under the UN's auspices that have ultimately led to additional actions like sanctions, or in some cases prosecutions. And that's what we think is warranted here too. The world has become more aware of and alive to the consequences of the Chinese government's human rights violations. I think for a long time, people thought that these were abuses that took place far away and didn't have any impact on them. In both places, we have seen Uyghur and other Turkic communities from China continue to be harassed by Chinese authorities, even though they've become citizens of these other countries. Sometimes Uyghurs and others are at risk of being forcibly returned to China by other governments. And we could even talk about how the pandemic, I think, became much worse because the Chinese government wasn't willing to let people freely report on what was happening in the early stages in Wuhan, either doctors or citizen journalists. And that's had implications for people all over the world. And so I think there is a much greater awareness that getting the Chinese government to play by agreed upon human rights standards is critical. And it's worth pointing out that the Chinese government has itself volunteered to sign up to these human rights rules. And now the key is really holding senior officials accountable. I think the sanctions are certainly a step in the right direction, both on individual members of the Chinese government, but also on certain kinds of Chinese government entities, whether they're Xinjiang Regional Police Forces or the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is sort of a quasi-military economic entity that's unique to the region and is very enmeshed in a lot of business operations. And we've certainly called on businesses to be much more aware of their investments in that region because of concerns about forced labor. And so, companies from the Middle East will want to pay attention to this. But what we really need to see, you're right, we've heard more about this problem, but what we need to see governments do is come together at a body like the United Nations Human Rights Council and support precisely the kind of investigation that would take place in other parts of the world. Human Rights Watch was quite encouraged last year when the Human Rights Council got behind an investigation into racism and police violence here in the United States, Human Rights Watch thinks that's an incredibly appropriate and strong response. But we need to see other powerful governments like China's held accountable in similar ways. I'm sure it will react. I'm sure they've already dismissed our report as being, biased and baseless. We really wish they would engage in a discussion with us on the facts. But I think the very strong propaganda response we've seen over the last couple of months is actually a function of concerns about things like sanctions and the possibility of an investigation. The propaganda machinery has really gone into overdrive trying to reassure the world that there really aren't problems in Xinjiang. Xi Jinping has said himself that people across the region are happy. To which we say, if that's really the case, then there shouldn't be a problem allowing independent international investigators to come and check on the human rights situation across the region, without fear of reprisals for any of the people who speak with those investigators. The Chinese government will probably reject that, and indeed it's been stonewalling precisely this kind of investigation for the last 2 years. But it's important to understand that some of the most influential commissions of inquiry have taken place outside the country in question, because it's a typical response for governments to deny access. And indeed, one of the closest and we think most important parallels in recent years was an initiative that was jointly led by the European Union and the Organization for Islamic Cooperation at the Human Rights Council for an investigation into Myanmar government offenses against the Rohingya Muslims. And that was a very thoroughly done investigation by well-regarded experts who wound up making recommendations that are quite influential and that went a long way, we think, towards taking steps towards justice for a horrifically persecuted minority.